Welcome back, everyone. My name's Yusef Farrell. I'm a pharmacist in the US, and today we are heading back to the pharmacy. Last time we discussed the difference between tablets and capsules, and you may be asking me now, okay, Yusef, in the last video we discussed the differences between tablets and capsules. I now know that these two dosage forms have their differences. They're completely different. But what about ointments and creams? Surely they are very similar to each other, right? I mean, they look the same, they do the same things for the most part. What could possibly be different about them? Well, I would like to argue that there's more differences between ointments and creams than between tablets and capsules. And that's what we are going to be discussing today in this video. We're going to be discussing the differences between ointments and creams, how both are manufactured, and how both are used in practice. So let's get started. Okay, so we are going to be discussing ointments first. So the simplest definition of an ointment is a base that contains more hydrocarbons or a higher oil phase compared to its aqueous phase. So, and there's a specific percentages for each. So the oil phase has to be 50% or higher, and the water phase has to be 20% or lower. So that's like the simplest definition, but even then, ointments can actually be split into 4 different categories, as we will discuss right now. So you first have oleaginous bases. These are the bases that have the most oil or the most hydrocarbon content of all the ointment bases we'll discuss. And due to that high oil or hydrocarbon content, these types of bases provide a great protective layer to the skin, and they can remain on the skin for a long period of time as they don't evaporate as easily. But they can be very difficult to wash off, and they can be hard to actually spread over the skin. So you can think of something like petrolatum or yellow ointment, which is just a mix of wax, yellow wax, and petrolatum as an example of an oleaginous base. The second type of ointment base that you could find would be the absorption bases. And the absorption bases could be split into 2 different types. So you have the first type of absorption base, which will allow for the formation of a water and oil emulsion once the drug or the thing that the ingredients are added to it. And you have the other type, which it's already a water and oil emulsion, but just allows you to add other things to it. But otherwise, they fulfill the same sort of role in that they're like oleaginous bases, but they have a higher water content or higher aqueous content compared to oleaginous bases. So they can be easier to wash off the skin, but they're not as occlusive. They don't provide the same sort of protective layer as the oleaginous bases can. We would see these bases used when we are dealing with like a water-soluble drug or a drug that's better able to be dissolved in water compared to oil. So good examples of an aqueous base or of an absorption base would be stuff like Aquaphor or lanolin. Okay, next we have water removable bases. So these are essentially oil and water emulsions in which there is a lot more water compared to oil. And in fact, another name for these water removable bases is creams. Creams are essentially water removable bases. These definitions and terms come from when creams were just starting to enter into the market and it just wasn't as common. So that's why these terms are here, and that's why it's technically included under the ointment category. I don't think it should be used like that. I think it should be updated, but that's just what it is. We'll discuss creams and water removable bases a little bit later, but just understand that these types of bases have a lot more water content than oil content, but it is still a mix of both of those. And these types of bases can be easily washed off compared to the like oleaginous bases and absorption bases. So a good example of this would be like hydrophilic ointment. And then finally, you have water-soluble bases. So these are bases that do not contain any oil phase at all. They just consist of water, just a water content. And they even may be referred to as like greaseless bases. So you would find these bases used when you're trying to incorporate solids or certain drugs that just can't be in contact with oil, or just can't interact with oil at all. And you would use something like this potentially. A good example of this type of base would be a polyethylene glycol ointment. So when actually making ointments, what we would do is that we would have the ointment base and then we would have the drug. But the thing is, if you would try just to mix the drug directly into the ointment base, you would find that the final product would be very gritty, as the drug is not going to necessarily dissolve into the base. So a lot of times what we add something called a levigating agent, which is a substance that allows for the drug to be mixed into the base a lot more easier. And this substance would be similar to the base that we're using because it goes off the general chemistry rule. Like dissolves like. In order for something to be dissolved into another thing, they have to both be similar to each other. But in the case of ointments, which as we mentioned are oily, we would use a levigating agent like mineral oil, which is also oily. So you would add your mineral oil onto your powder, mix it around, and then you'd add it to your ointment base and then mix all that. And I've done this many times. I'll show like pictures here where I've actually created ointments and I've compounded those ointments before in the past. So that's essentially the general rule of creating ointments. It's you have your ointment base, your drug, and a levigating agent, and you either mix it all together. You can also kind of compress it through a roller. So ointments are preferred for dry, thickened, and scaly skin because of those occlusive and emollient properties. So it's occlusive in that it kind of provides a protective layer over the skin, and emollient in that it hydrates the skin. And keep in mind, when it comes to the skin, there's a lot of oil involved. It can interact positively with oil and become hydrated, become healthier with oil. So by adding that oil phase, you can actually really help the skin heal and protect it against other irritants, for example. And in fact, those properties could actually help the drug penetrate into the skin better than compared to creams. That's why technically ointments are considered higher potency or have a higher potency compared to creams. But there are some downsides. Ointments are not as spreadable as creams, so when a patient tries spreading an ointment onto their skin, it could be a little bit harder to actually spread it evenly across so you get every part of the skin. And they also may feel very uncomfortable or messy to patients because of that oily feeling and that oily layer that's left behind. And that could be a really big drawback for patients who just are irritated by that or who just don't like that feeling. So you'll see ointments used in areas of the body where there's less hair and the skin is smoother. So you could think something like the palms of your hand or like the soles of someone's feet as an example, as it's just simply more comfortable for patients. I'm sure everyone has had that experience of maybe trying to spread an ointment or something oily onto like a hairy part of the skin and it just doesn't work. It just sucks, right? But yeah, that's essentially a quick rundown of ointments. And the cool thing about ointments is that they're pretty cheap to make, as you really only need 3 ingredients: the drug, the base, and the levigating agent. And in fact, I'll show some examples here of ointments on the market, and you can see that in the entire ingredient list, it's very few ingredients. You can see between 3 to 5 ingredients. Sometimes other stuff is added like scents or antimicrobials or preservatives as an example. Yeah, that's really ointments. Some cool examples of ointments on the market that you could find would be stuff like Eucrisa, which is used for eczema or plaque psoriasis. You can also find Neosporin, which is a very common over-the-counter antibiotic ointment used for like cuts or scrapes. And you can also find Protopic, which is just tacrolimus ointment, which is also used for like stuff like plaque psoriasis or eczema or those like skin conditions, for example. Okay, next we have creams. So Creams are essentially the opposite of ointments, and where there's a higher water content compared to oil content. And again, it's the same thing. So the water content would be 20% or higher, and the oil content would be 50% or lower. So it's literally a flip on the ointments. It's just more water content compared to oil. Now, the creams, or the water removable bases, as we discussed earlier, can also be split into two categories. So you first have your water and oil emulsions, or your oily creams, essentially. These are creams that the oil phase is the external phase. That's what's actually interacting with the skin, that oily phase. But because of the higher water content, these types of creams are less greasy than ointments and are easier to spread, and they're more easily washed off the skin. But they do leave behind an oily phase, not as much as ointments though. And they're not going to have the same occlusive or emollient properties as ointments, just because it has a lower oil content. So you're not going to really see these for like dry skin conditions, as they're not going to work as well. But you would use these types of bases for drugs that are more easily dissolved in oils or lipids. So an example of this type of base would be like a cold cream, for example. And then next you have oil and water emulsions, which is the opposite, where the water phase is what's actually interacting with the skin. These are also called aqueous creams, or washable creams, or vanishing creams also. So these creams can be rubbed onto the skin, and they can provide a cooling sensation, but the main thing about them is that once it's rubbed into the skin, the water content evaporates, and then you leave behind a very thin layer of oil. So it's not as messy as ointments. It's a lot more pleasant for patients, and you essentially don't really feel it. And you'd use this base for water-soluble drugs, or drugs that are more likely to be dissolved in water. An example of this would be, like we mentioned, hydrophilic ointment. When making creams, it's the same sort of process. You have your base, you have your drug, but you also add in a levigating agent to help the drug mix within the cream better and mix within the base better. In this case, though, you would use a levigating agent that's more like water, that's more aqueous. So stuff like glycerin or propylene glycol would be good examples, and I've used both of those in the past. Personally, when making creams, I'll show more pictures here. But in general, creams are a little bit harder to make, as they do require more ingredients, because you not only do you have the base and the drug and the levigating agent, you're also including things like parabens or antimicrobials, because that water content can be conducive to bacterial growth, for example. And you just want to add other things to, for example, make the cream a lot more stiff and just a lot more manageable. But as we mentioned, creams are a lot more pleasant for patients. They tend to evaporate or be absorbed into the skin. They don't leave behind the same sort of oily layer that ointments would, but they are less hydrating than ointments, and they're not as occlusive. They're not going to provide the same sort of protective layer, which can also affect drug absorption. The drug may not be absorbed into the skin as well with creams compared to ointments. And like we mentioned, that's why ointments are considered to be higher potency compared to creams. The good thing about creams is that they could be used essentially in any part of the body, whether it's the face, the trunk, the arms, the genital areas, can really be used anywhere. And they could even be used for like mucousy memories, so inside the body. So think like rectally or vaginally, and like, suppositories or vaginal creams as an example. You're going to find creams be used in dry skin and like weepy skin conditions. So conditions where the skin is like weeping, or there's stuff coming out of the skin. So like pus or fluids, for example. And you're going to see these be used in conditions like psoriasis or eczema, as they're really great to be used in those areas of the skin where they're more flexible, you're moving around a lot more, or in more sensitive areas, again, like the face or genitals. So some cool examples of creams being used on the market, you have Zorvi and Opzelura, which are both used for stuff like plaque psoriasis or like those skin conditions that we mentioned before. You also have Winlevi, which is a cool cream that's used for acne. At the end of the day, as we see, ointments and creams have their differences and they must be chosen carefully in order for the patient to receive the maximum benefits from these formulations. And there's many things that have to be considered by both the prescriber and the pharmacist when we are dispensing or prescribing these creams or ointments. We have to consider the patient's condition, the properties of the formulations, and just the patient's preferences in general when deciding on a product. I hope you all enjoyed the video. Let me know what you thought of it, what you liked, what you disliked, what you think can be improved upon, and some other video ideas that you'd like to see in the future. Please like and share this video. It really helps me out to grow this channel. And please subscribe for more content like this. Hope to see you all next time as we delve further into the amazing world of pharmacy. Thank you, everyone.